Today, we're going to be making the most unbelievable buttermilk biscuit recipe, but we're going to be testing it 5 different ways. One batch with all butter, one with all shortening, one with half butter, half shortening, one batch with all lard or bacon fat, and the last batch is going to have half butter and half bacon fat. And what's really amazing testing the different fats side by side is you can really see what the fat actually does and the flavor and the texture that it adds to each individual biscuit. And there was one undisputed, winner of all of them. And so I can't wait to show you the process. And I really want you to bake these unbelievable buttermilk biscuits.
Okay, so with the buttermilk biscuits, as with all of the recipes, I really prefer to weigh out the ingredients. Now, I will give you the traditional measurements, but I'm showing you this way because it actually is quite a bit easier when you add everything to your bowl. So I zeroed out the scale with the sifter on top so that I could just keep that on there and then sift all of the ingredients directly into the bowl. I didn't have to get out any extra measuring tools or anything. So now I'm gonna cut in the cold butter. I've had the butter in the freezer, and so it's really, really cold. But I really wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to melt, because melting the butter is not good. We want it to be flaky, so all the fat and all the liquids need to be super cold, including the sour cream and buttermilk mixture. Now I'm just mixing it until it just kind of starts to come together. And instead of just dumping a whole bunch of extra flour onto the surface, I'm actually going to just keep the flour onto the side of my dough, because I only want to tap my hands into the flour as needed. Right now, it's not sticking, and I really want all of the extra pieces to adhere to the ball of dough, so I'm not flouring anything yet. However, I'm going to use a bench scraper to cut the dough while I'm laminating it, and this will also allow me to kind of pick it up off of the surface. Now, lamination is a process where you're going to be layering the fat in the pastry, and so I'm cutting it directly in the middle and just pressing it down with my hands in between each cut, and then placing it on top so that we can layer in the fat, and that's going to bring in flaky, beautiful biscuit layers. So the bench scraper is going to be the perfect tool. You could use a knife, of course, with this if you didn't have it, but I really highly recommend getting a bench scraper just for this task. I'm going to do 6 of these cuts, and so 6 times I'm going to flatten them out and put them on top of one another. And again, I just gently tap my hands in the flour if I need to keep it from sticking into my hands. And I'm not even using a rolling pin. I'm only using my hands because I don't want to flatten out the dough that much, because I really need it to be about 1 inch thick, maybe even a little bit more. And a rolling pin will just roll it out too thinly. I really don't need that. I only need my hands for this task. And I'm also dipping the biscuit cutter into the flour so that it does not stick. And I just pop it straight down, and I don't twist it around because that might mess up the layers. And then I'm just using my hands to kind of press in the extra pieces of the remaining dough. And I used a medium-sized biscuit cutter, but you can use whichever size you want. And then I'm going to actually brush it with buttermilk on top before I place it in the oven. And this is what it looks like when it comes out. Then I'm going to be brushing it with more melted butter when it comes out to really give it a nice buttery surface.
I probably made them a little bit thicker than I had anticipated, but the good part of that is that they're, a bit fluffier, like this one a little bit higher. So you can kind of customize like how thick or thin you want them. If you want to make more biscuits but like thicker ones, you can just use the smallest biscuit cutter size. So you make smaller biscuits, or you might need to double the recipe to use a medium or a large size one that still has a little bit of thickness. Oh my goodness, these are so buttery and delicious.
All right, now for the all shortening biscuits. So the same deal, I put it in the freezer. You can also keep it in the fridge overnight, but I popped it in the freezer for a couple of hours just to get it nice and extra cold. Now this pastry cutter that I'm using is an excellent tool for cutting in the fat. You can also use a fork, but you have to work a little bit harder and it can kind of bend the fork sometimes. You can also use your fingers, but sometimes that can heat up the fat a little bit, so I prefer a pastry cutter because it makes sure to keep everything cold. So all the ingredients are the same. I'm mixing in the sour cream and the buttermilk and mixing them together only in just everything kind of just comes together. And so there's going to be extra dry pieces that don't get fully coated in the liquid, but we can actually help work that in when we dump it onto the surface. And so again, when you add extra flour, like if you dump a whole bunch of dry flour onto your surface and press your biscuit dough to this, unfortunately, it can dry out your biscuit. And so that's why it's best to keep a separate pile to the side and just use the bench scraper to lift the biscuit dough up off the surface to keep it from sticking, and tap your hands in the flour to keep it from sticking to your hands. It's the easiest way, and that way we're going to keep everything nice and tender and moist, and we're not going to dry out our biscuits. So we're doing the exact same method. We're doing the 6 beautiful layers here, and this dough is a little bit softer than the butter just based on the touch. So you can kind of see about how thick it is, the same thickness, and I'm gonna place it into a round. Now you can also cut these into squares, and then that way you don't have any excess. So you just make sure that you'll need to shape it in such a way that you can make equally sized square portions. But if you like the traditional round shape, you'll probably want to use a biscuit cutter, which is the easiest thing to use. Also, the bench scraper is great for lifting up the cut piece of dough off of the counter without having to make it stick. So buttermilk glaze on top, pop it in the oven, and then we brush it with butter after it's done. And so you can see this is a really beautiful, soft and tender crumb, and it's just delightful.
Yeah. The all shortening is softer than the butter one, flakier. It doesn't have the buttery flavor as much, but if you add butter to the inside, it's good. This is so far maybe even a little bit better, maybe, than the butter. Yeah, so good. Oh my God.
All right, now let's do the half butter, half shortening biscuits. Exact same process. I put the shortening and the butter in the freezer. Now, shortening tends to melt a little bit easier than butter. So the chunks of the butter can be a little bit harder to press through. So sometimes you got to work it a little bit, but you definitely want the pieces to be little tiny bite-sized pieces when it's cut into the dough. I also forgot to film adding in the sour cream and buttermilk, but it is in the dough at this point. And so this one has like a really nice consistency to it. And the overall dough just felt really, really nice. So again, I needed to flour my hands a little bit more with this one. It just could have been, there may have just been slightly more moisture in this one than in some of the other batches. But I do think the combo of the shortening and the butter maybe had something to do with that as well. So same process here. 6 layers of dough lamination. Now, if you really like extra soft biscuits and you prefer just really soft and tender biscuits, you don't have to do any of the lamination. You can simply place the dough onto the surface and just go ahead and cut. But for me, I like soft and flaky, and doing a lamination like this will still keep the softness, but you're still going to have flaky layers. Now, this batch, if you want a bigger batch, let's say you want 12 biscuits, just double this recipe here. And the one downside to having to hand cut all of these is that you will have usually 2 biscuits out of each batch that are going to be pieced together. But if you're just really gentle with your hands and you don't press too firmly, everything is going to be great and they will taste delicious too.
All right, let's see. That one, the half and half, I don't know how any other recipe could beat that one. That is amazing.
So now for the lard biscuits, we obviously need to start with cooking the bacon. So I like to cook it on a sheet pan because it's just easier and less messy, and then all of the fat just kind of stays in the sheet pan. Then I'm going to pour it out, and then it's going to, when you freeze it, it's going to freeze as a solid mass. So once it's frozen, cut it into chunks. So just cut the chunks up a little bit, like once it's frozen, and then you can cut it into your dough. Now, as with the shortening, this one also feels quite nice and soft. And so using your hands can be a little bit trickier. So I really do love using the pastry cutter to actually cut it in. It just is a lot cleaner. It's a lot less messy, and you don't melt the fat with your with the warmth of your hands. So I did have to use a little bit of extra flour with this, but again, like, we're not folding in all kinds of extra flour into the dough. And if you've noticed how I've made each of these batches, we're not adding in like an extra half a cup of flour, because oftentimes if you're dumping a whole bunch of flour onto the surface, you're adding a half a cup sometimes almost of extra flour into your dough without even realizing it. And that's just going to dry it out. And we don't need that. We have the perfect amount of ingredients in terms of flour and fat and moisture. So I'm doing the 6 layers of lamination, and then like a little soft pillow, patting it very gently with my hands. And so when you pick it up, just be super gentle because you don't want it to fall apart. And then when you're piecing it together, also same deal. So this one is going to be the same deal. The last 2 pieces are going to be kind of pieced together. But no worries, because sometimes that creates little extra pockets of like flakiness, and it's not perfect, but it's still delicious. So we're going to do the buttermilk glaze on this one. We're going to pop it in the oven, and the smell in your house is going to be absolutely incredible with these. You will not be sad you made them.
I don't think I can accurately describe how good that is. The lard, like the bacon, I mean, it just comes through. It's soft. It's not quite as flaky as some of the other ones, but it is still pretty flaky. This one wins. It's the undisputed winner.
The lard was my favorite. But then you mix it with the butter and then it completely transforms it. It doesn't make sense to do half shortening, half lard, because the shortening and the lard are kind of doing the same thing, but the butter is adding butter flavor. So you've got the flavor of the lard, the bacon fat, and then also the flavor of the butter, and they're like coming together to make the most perfect biscuit I have ever had in my entire life. I mean, I would take any of the other 4 any day, but this one, absolutely sensational. Sensational. You have to make these biscuits.